Teacher. Okay, go sit down. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your refreshments. Now we come to a very special part of this morning's session, and that is to hear somebody who has lived through the Holocaust, and Stephen Frank will be sharing part of his personal history with you. Just before Stephen starts, just to let you know, I mentioned it before, that when he has finished his talk, there will be an opportunity for you to ask him your own questions. And then after that, we are going to hand each one of you a blank postcard. And what we'd like you to do is to write a few lines to Stephen. Well, without more ado, I shall introduce you to Stephen Frank. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Frank, and I was born in Amsterdam in Holland in 1935. My story is in 4 chapters. The first chapter I've called The Initiation. That's from a blissfully happy and somewhat privileged childhood, right up to the point when I became aware that I was different from the other children in the street where I lived in Amsterdam and the little school that I had started to attend. The second chapter I've called The Incarceration. Life for a Jew became more and more difficult after the Germans had invaded in May 1940. More and more restrictions were slowly brought in, very, very stealthily done. And by the time it came to 1943, in March 1943, in fact, we were taken away from our home, and I spent the next 2.5 years in 3 different camps. The third chapter I've called The Liberation. That was the 9th of May, 1945. That was a day that we prayed for, hoped for, longed for, and then suddenly there it was. We were, in fact, the very last place to be liberated when the Second World War came to an end. And finally, a chapter which I won't have much time to go into, which I've called The Rehabilitation or Homecoming. That's in June 1945, and when I was dumped on the runway at Croydon Airport in South London with my mother and my 2 brothers, having been flown by 2 RAF pilots of Transport Command who flew us from Pilsen in the Czech Republic via Paris to London. And they were on their way actually to Manchester, and they just sort of dropped us off at London's major airport. Could you imagine trying to do something like that today? And there we were standing on the runway thinking what would happen next. The immigration people never came, nobody came at all. And then another airplane landed, and a whole lot of people got out of that. And they turned out to be Britons who'd been interned in countries in Europe, and when war was declared, couldn't get back, and were now coming home. And we just sort of joined them, and that's how I came here. So I always think I'm a bit of an illegal immigrant in a funny sort of way. And I was going to say now that we're all happy members in the EU, but we're not going to be happy members in the EU, but I think I'll probably be allowed to stay here. Right. First of all, something about my family. My father was born in the city of Zwolle, where his father was an eminent surgeon and the director of the local municipal hospital there. And his mother was the very first woman to serve on the town council of that city. So it was the beginning of women taking part in local government. They had 4 children, of which my father was the youngest and the only boy. He was clever, sporty, intelligent, and he went off to the University of Leiden, where he read law, graduated with a first-class honours degree, went on to do a doctorate, and during his time there he co-authored a book about the history of the Students' Union of that university, and that university goes back to the 16th century, so this was a massive work. He also rowed for the university and was captain of the university hockey club, and in the 1928 Olympic Games, which were held in Amsterdam, he was one of the umpires for that particular tournament. And he also wrote a book for the Dutch Hockey Association about the laws and tactics of hockey, hockey being one of the major sports being played in Holland at that time. After he'd finished his studies, he went into practice as a lawyer, and his offices were on one of those lovely old canals in the center of Amsterdam. My mother came from a completely different background altogether. Her parents were both professional musicians, violinists, who came from Holland to England to work here. My mother was born in Eastbourne on the south coast, the middle of three sisters. Again, her mother, my maternal grandmother, was again a bit of a pioneer because she was the very first woman in this country to set up an all-professional female orchestra. It was called the Windsor Ladies Orchestra in 1899. And my grandfather, who basically most of his life led small orchestras on his violin and violin like a violinist conductor type of thing, he when he'd finished his playing days, he went into music publishing, and this would be in the beginning of the 20th century. And he published many well-known songs, which probably you won't have heard about, but some of the older ones here may. Things like Roll Out the Barrel, Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag, and Now Is the Hour When We Must Say Goodbye. But he became infamous because he published a piece of music which became a #1 hit. But the music was so easy to play on any instrument you care to name, and the lyrics were dead easy. The company made no money because in those days, of course, you sold music on sheets. No sheets, very few sheets music was distributed because it was so easy to learn. And it is today the most popular song still sung in this country. Now what is it? Deathly Silence. Right, I'll tell you. Happy birthday to you. So anybody whose birthday is today, happy birthday. Anyway, my mother wasn't an academic, like my father, and when she'd finished her schooling, which was then in London, they decided to send her to Amsterdam to learn how to cook and to keep house and to do awkward things like ironing men's shirts, so that you ladies could, when you were getting married, could keep your man in the style and comfort that we fellas ought to be kept in. However, things have changed a bit since then, but that's how it was in those days. And so there was my mother in Holland, riding a bicycle in the park, and there are many, many bicycles in Holland, when she got a puncture. And she stood by the side of her bike looking like a forlorn maiden, when this nice young man came along and offered to mend the puncture, and they looked into one another's eyes, and that was it. And as a result of that, I'm here today. And the first picture I'm going to show you is of that happy day when they were married. I briefly want to go through the people on this wedding list and what happened to them, because their experiences were completely different. First of all, the little old lady looking over my mother's shoulder in the black shroud was my paternal grandmother, and she died in 1939, therefore missed the war. The lady on my mother's right there was her younger sister, who again completely missed the war, having gone to live in New York. The lady on my father's left there is my cousin. This is where the whole of the generations go completely haywire. She happened to be the eldest daughter of my father's eldest sister, and she was almost as old as my mum. We were secular Jews. We weren't religious at all, although my father did have interest in religious organizations, but we didn't go to the synagogue, we didn't eat kosher food or anything like that at all. We were basically Dutch people who just happened to be Jewish. And she had married a non-Jew. And when the Germans invaded Holland, she went into hiding, just like Anne Frank went into hiding, which no doubt you've probably read in your primary schools. And she was lucky because her husband could get some of the things that she would needed, and they had a close family friend who would get those sort of things that you have to get. And when you go into hiding, you depend on the outside for everything that you need to get. She was in hiding in her own home, though. She never left her house. And during that time, she gave birth to 2 sons, all alone. No doctor, no midwife. It was far too dangerous to bring anybody in, because there were plenty of people on the outside who would shop you to the German authorities for betraying Jews, hiding in non-Jewish households. You got handsomely paid by the authorities for that. Both those births were successful, and after the war, she gave birth to yet a 3rd son, and she died well into her 90s several years ago. The next person on that list, the little girl Jeteke, she was just 15, so roughly about the same age as you. She was also hidden, but she was hidden by the Dutch resistance. And the Dutch resistance would find a home where non-Jews lived who were prepared to hide a Jew or a Jewish family in their house. They were very brave to do that sort of thing, because if you were found out, you were either shot or you were imprisoned or you were sent off to the camps as well. So people like that were very, very brave indeed. So she would be hidden in a house, and then when the resistance got word that that household had been betrayed, they'd get there before the Germans, whip her out, and put her into another safe house. And when the same thing happened again, they whip her out and put her into another. And she spent those war years going from one hiding place to another, to another, to another, and remained one step ahead of the Germans throughout the war, and died sadly at the beginning of December last year, aged 91. And finally, the little boy in the sailor suit, Leo, her elder brother, he was just 19 at the time. He set up a very active Dutch resistance group, and they were very much involved in making themselves a nuisance to the German occupying forces by derailing trains, blowing up bridges. And on one occasion they ambushed a car carrying a much hated and feared SS general, a chap called General Seifert. And in the ensuing battle that took place, they assassinated this guy, and they all got away. But later on he was caught and summarily executed in Bloemendaal in 1943. After the war, he was regarded as one of the great heroes of the Dutch resistance, and there are several streets and squares that are named after him throughout the Netherlands. He also appears in an honours book in the lower houses of Parliament in The Hague, where about 1,700 Dutch resistance workers are commemorated. He's in there, my father's also in there, and 3 other cousins. So it's a valuable piece of book for me. Well, that's everybody on that wedding photograph. Now, this is a bit of self-admiration, really, because it's just illustrating happy childhood. That was me as a baby with my elder brother. Do you think I was a beautiful baby? Yes, of course I was. Yes, right, that's right. This next photograph was taken of me as a family photograph at the birth of my younger brother. That's me in the middle there with that fantastic hairdo. This is a very precious photograph for me because I just want you to look at the eyes of everybody, even the baby. Those eyes, they show love and happiness and contentedness, you know. It's a wonderful example of a really happy, nice family. This next slide is one when I was about 5, I suppose, something like that, taken. Not a care in the world, or perhaps a bit younger. This next slide was taken in January 1941. In January, in the winter, that's me sitting on the sledge there with my little brother, also in a grey jacket, crying behind because there was no room for him on the sledge. He was always like that, my little brother. The sledge went into hiding and was retrieved after the war. We used it as children here in England, and my children used it, and my grandchildren used it, and then it hung on a wall. Nobody was using it. And today it resides in a museum at the Holocaust Centre in Newark in Nottinghamshire, if ever you go down there. And just finally, a picture taken at the seaside, just a typical family photograph. But you can see this lovely, happy, carefree, and many, many happy memories that I have of what it was like before the Germans invaded Holland. And when they did, of course, when they invaded Holland, the first thing they did was they wanted to find out where the Jews were living, so they went to the civil service, and the civil service obliged them. In fact, there's even a map of Amsterdam, and it shows the houses with red dots in them where the Jews were living throughout the city of Amsterdam. They were meticulous in the civil service, how they behaved towards their new masters. And then, of course, the Germans had a problem because, you know, Holland had always been a very free country, so Jews had married non-Jews. What do we do about these half-Jews? Are these half-Jews more Jewish if their mother's Jewish as opposed to their father? And what do we do if these half-Jews marry a Jew or a non-Jew or another half-Jew? What about their children? So the Germans set up the Nuremberg laws to determine how Jewish a Jew was. And I will give you an example of that later on. Right, where do we go from there? Let me have a look. In November 1940, civil servants were dismissed. So if you worked in the town hall, or you were a lecturer at the university, like my uncle, who was a professor of economics at the University of Amsterdam, he was sacked. You're a parkkeeper, a librarian, anything to do with the civil service or local government, you were suddenly just thrown out of work, and the dole was very little. Just going back again to how Jewish a Jew was, this was my identity card, and you will see that on the left-hand side is the Star of David, and underneath it, it was issued by this Jewish Council of Amsterdam, which was set up in order to inform the Jewish population of what they were now not allowed to do anymore. As slowly the screw began to turn against you. So they knew exactly who you were and where you were. On the right, where I lived, my surname, my first and second names, my date of birth, where I was born, my nationality, NED, Netherlands, Dutch. The next one's quite interesting. The G-E-E-N is Dutch for none. My religion is shown there as none, because we were secular Jews. But right at the very bottom, you'll see the word V-I-E-R, which is Dutch for four. I had 4 grandparents who were considered Jewish, so I was also one of these sort of subhuman species. Adults were issued with identity cards, and this very next slide shows you the identity card of my mother. So when she was stopped in the street, they would immediately know that she was Jewish. If you were Protestant or Catholic, for example, there would be nothing to show. But identity cards for adults were obligatory for them to hold. Where do we go from there? One interesting thing about it, this identity card, is that it is in fact on display in the Imperial War Museum in London, if ever you go there. Just an example of the exclusions of what happened. In May 1940, restrictions started to come in. We were banned from going to sitting on benches. That had notices on them saying "Verboden für Joden." So if you were old, you couldn't sit on benches in the street. We were banned from using public parks. I remember very much we had a park at the end of the street where I lived. I used to play with my friends, and suddenly a notice appeared on the gate which said "Verboden für Joden." I wasn't allowed to go in. They could go in and play. I couldn't understand why being a Jew meant you couldn't play. I hadn't vandalized anything. I hadn't broken anything in there. Then we were banned from going into shops, school, work. There was curfews imposed, and so it went on all the time. This next one is a very good example of exclusion. This is a well-known photograph of an open-air swimming pool in a place called Krimpen on the Lek, which is near Rotterdam. 3 little boys standing outside with their bathing costumes wrapped up in their towels. The notice on the post above them says "Für Joden verboden," so they couldn't go in to swim. Not because they got verrucas on their feet or anything like that, but purely just because they were Jews and nothing else. By that time, I'd started in my little primary school, and my primary school was the very first primary school that was built just like what your primary schools look like today. Nice, open, airy classrooms, completely different from the sort of rather Victorian attitude that there was. And suddenly I was taken away from my school and put into an all-Jewish school where all the desks were one behind the other. And what I remember most about being in that school was that probably just like yourselves, when you go into the classroom, you tend to sit next to the same person. Suddenly that person next to me wasn't there. No, he wasn't sick. He'd been invited to be resettled in the East, or he'd been just picked up and taken away, or if he was lucky, he'd gone into hiding. And then it would happen to the person on my right, and then my friend would disappear, or suddenly we had a new teacher. And you had this sort of feeling of movement in your classroom. And so just like pebbles on the bottom of a stream, you're all pebbles, and then suddenly the stream starts to flow faster, and pebbles around you start to move away, and other pebbles stay at their place, and then they move away, until, of course, the stream gets so fast that my pebble rolls away. One of the problems, of course, the problems the Germans had was, what does a Jew look like? They don't all have big noses, go around counting money. They don't all look like Fagin in Oliver, or the other guy in the other place. I've forgotten it now. But there are lots of sort of caricatures with the Jew. They're just like anybody else. Some are tall, some are short, some are fat, some are thin. I was a typical little Dutch boy with blonde hair and blue eyes, and I wore clogs just like all the others. So they had to think of some system whereby they marked the Jew. And they did this by taking one of the holiest emblems of the Jewish faith, the Star of David. And you can see there the way that the word Jew, Jood in Dutch, is written. Here's the star that I've got. It still has the bits of cotton attached to it, where my mother took it off our clothes after the war. But look at the way the word Jew is written. This is another way the Nazis like to mock the Jewish faith by writing the words in this sort of mock Hebrew lettering. It's completely rubbish, you know. Besides, Hebrew's written from right to left anyway. And so it just made a mockery of it all. So you might wonder, why on earth did we remain in Holland? When did we get out? You know, my mother had family here in England. My father was an eminent lawyer by then. He was high in the judicial procedures. He knew exactly what would happen if the Germans invaded Holland. Why didn't we get out? Well, the reason we didn't go was because my father by then was very much involved with people who were less fortunate than we were, and he was particularly interested in mental health. And there was a very famous Jewish mental hospital in Holland called it Apeldoornse Bos. And he was on the board of this hospital, and many others as well, for that matter. And he realized if the Germans invaded Holland, if you were a Jew, that was dangerous. But oh boy, if you were a mentally handicapped or physically handicapped Jew, you were right at the top of the list for extermination. After all, the Germans had exterminated 250,000 of their own handicapped people until there was uproar about that in the general population. So my father wouldn't leave these people. He hadn't got it in his heart to leave and go over to England with his family to the safety there and leave these people to their fate. He needed to speak to them. And so he remained. My father joined the Dutch resistance. He was involved in finding hiding places for Jews to hide. We also hid Jews in our own home from time to time. Not many Jews hid Jews in their own homes, but we did. He was also a link in a chain whereby Jews who were desperate to get out of Holland would have to wait to have false papers made for them, which they would then come to my father's office to collect. And by that time, my father, as a lawyer, was only allowed to give legal advice to Jews. All his non-Jewish clients had been removed from his list. He wasn't allowed to give them legal advice. And when they were at his office for this sort of legal advice, they got their papers which would get them through Holland, through Belgium, through France, to the Alps, where there was a guide that would take these people by some goat track over the top of the Alps and down the other side into the safety of neutral Switzerland. My father was going to work, and by that time, of course, he was not allowed to use public transport. You weren't allowed to use a bike. You could only walk. So he used to have to set off early, and it was in October 1942 that he set off to go to work, kissed us all goodbye, as he always did, and I never saw him again. We know from eyewitness accounts that at about 11 o'clock that morning, his office door was burst open. The German security people stormed in. He'd been betrayed. They took him to the SS headquarters in Amsterdam at the Weteringsschans. There he was almost certainly tortured. From there he was taken to the prison at Amersfoort, where he was again tortured. And from there, in terrible physical condition, was taken to the transit camp Westerbork. And from there, after about a week, he was taken on a cattle truck and sent to Auschwitz, where he was murdered in the gas chambers on the 21st of January 1943, aged just 39. In his short life, he had done so many really good things for his fellow human beings. Just to give you one example, he actually set up with a group of lawyers in Amsterdam what in this country we call legal aid, helping the poor of Amsterdam get legal redress through the courts, which they couldn't possibly afford to pay for. But these people saw that the law should be equal to everybody, irrespective of how much money they had. When my father was arrested, my mother really then came into the fore, very much so. First of all, she found out where he was imprisoned in the prison. She found out who the cleaners were, changed places with one of the cleaners, went in there disguised as a man, scrubbing the floors, spoke with my father, who had told her that he had not given anything away, and that was corroborated in a letter that we only got a hold of about a couple of years ago. She opened up part of our house as a school for Jewish children who by then had been banned from all state schools and had nowhere to be educated. She cut Jewish men's hair because if you wanted to have your hair cut, you could only get it cut by a Jewish barber, and there were no Jewish barbers in the district where we lived. And it was in those ways that she managed to keep body and soul together. And whilst he was imprisoned, something happened which made a deep impression upon me much later in my life. three of his friends, these three men, Ernst Heldring, Jan Wiertsma, and Arnold Dailly, the last one, a banker, actually became the Lord Mayor or the Burgomaster of Amsterdam not long after the war. These three men petitioned the German authorities for clemency for my father. This was a very dangerous thing to do. You're appealing to a group of people who have a fanatical hatred of Jews, and particularly of a Jew who was in the Dutch resistance. These people were in danger of appealing, but they were married men and they had children, yet they were prepared to stick their head over the parapet and plead for a friend. And ever since I've known that, friendship has been a very, very important part of my life. One of the greatest things you can have in your life is a good, loyal friend. You don't turn away when your friend's in trouble. You stand by them, you help them as best as you can. There's a saying in English, I don't know if you know it, a friend in need is a friend indeed. And how true that is. It's one of the greatest assets you can have, is a good friend. The Germans wouldn't relent as far as my father was concerned, but they did allow his wife and three children, after much badgering by these three men, to be put on a special list that the Germans had set up in Holland. You've got to remember that of the 140,000 Jews that were living in Holland when the Germans invaded, 110,000 of them were carted off to the camps. So to stop mass panic, they divided people off, promising all sorts of things which were never kept. And we were put on this Barneveld list, and as it says right near the bottom there, we would not, the last sentence on there, we would not be sent to a work camp abroad. Buitenland is abroad. We would not be sent to a work camp abroad, so we'd be allowed to remain in Holland. But they didn't like us remaining in our homes, and we had to report to the station to be sent to this place called Barneveld. Oh, that went off on its own. And so we went on a train, and that took us northeastwards to this place called Barneveld. Now, what's happened here? Let's have a look. That's funny. Let's go on. Yeah, that's right. Barneveld was a strange place. It was a castle. It had no fences, no barbed wire. Sheer fear kept you there. You know, keep your head down. The war can't go on forever. When it's over, we'll be able to go back to our... What's happening here? Here we are. We'll be able to go back to our own homes. So people stay there. And all I can say is that the people who are on this Barneveld list are only described as the sort of top echelons of Dutch Jewish society. So you had professors and doctors and musicians and composers and actors and all these sort of top people of Dutch Jewish society were there. And I can remember very clearly, I was sort of 7 years old, and I was in the process of learning my multiplication tables. And if you can remember that far yourself, you know, you learnt them by rote, or we did anyway. You know, 1 7's a 7, 2 7's a 14, 3 7's a 21, 4 7's a 28, you know, that sort of thing. But we were being taught these tables by some professor of mathematics at one of the universities. And he couldn't understand, why the hell we couldn't understand what he was talking about. And that's why we have primary school teachers for primary schools, secondary school teachers for secondary schools, and lecturers and people like that for universities, and you know, for undergraduates and graduates and people like that. The strange thing about the short time I spent in this camp, I did learn a love of gardening. We were given a little plot which we had to dig and weed, and then rake into a fine tilth, and I was given some radish seeds to plant, and I planted a big SF in mine with these little purple balls. And lo and behold, 10 days later, a little green SF appeared in my plot. And I thought, wow, isn't gardening or nature a wonderful, wonderful thing? My elder brother, who had a plot next to mine, had no interest in gardening whatsoever. He insisted on planting bananas in his. Needless to say, nothing ever did come up on his little plot. And then suddenly, after 7 months, I think it was, the German army stormed into the camp, gave everybody 20 minutes to prepare, and we were allowed one small rucksack or a small suitcase, and we were taken by train to this place called Westerbork. Let's see if it'll come up on here. Westerbork, there we are. Westerbork was in an isolated area to the north of the country. It was the main transit camp where most of the Jews to Holland went before they went further east. It put the fear of God into everybody, really, to be going there. Here it is. The blue is a moat sunk about 6 feet deep. It's got barbed wire fences in front and behind it. The green squares are watchtowers with German guards looking down upon you with machine guns and searchlights. The black and white stripes in the center was the main railway line that came into the camp. We were housed in barrack number 85 down the bottom there, later to be moved to barrack number 71. Here, the next slide is an artistic impression of what it looked like. All 660 of this Barneveldt group were crammed into this one barrack, men on the right, women and children on the left. We have here a photograph of what Westerbork looked like. That is not snow, by the way, on the ground. That's sand. There was no paving stones or anything like that there. So when the wind blew, the sand would blow into everything. And when it was wet, you sort of stepped into the slush and the mud and things like that. In the foreground there, you have a barrack. In front of those windows would be a trestle table holding about 12, 14 people. You got to know those people. That was your little social group that you got to know really well. And on our table, we had a delightful elderly couple who were great Anglophiles. And they would reminisce with my mother about happy holidays they'd spent in England, speaking with her in English, which after all was my mother's mother tongue. You do a lot of reminiscing in a place like that. In between the windows would be bunk beds, 2 high, steel there, and as the pitch went up, you had bunk beds 3 high in the pitch of the roof there. To the left of the chimney stack, you see a toilet block, and on, again, this was a pit dug in the sand, over which they put planks of wood with holes in. It's probably the biggest bog I've ever been in, some 70 seats, 2 rows of 35, back to back. Men and women were all in together. You could imagine it was particularly embarrassing for the women to be in there, all in with the men. There was no sort of women on the right, men on the left. It's just wherever there was a spare space, because the hygienic conditions within this camp were pretty awful. Most people had dysentery. That's when you got the runs. Lice were everywhere. Scarlet fever, yellow jaundice, polio was rife in the camp. So, you know, the hygienic conditions were sort of pretty awful there. Here on this next slide is an artistic impression of what it looked like in a barrack, but even that central gangway was blocked with beds. I was sleeping on the top, but I was lucky that I didn't have to share my bed with anybody. But, you know, you could be fast asleep, and then somebody wanted to go to the toilet, and there's no light, it's in the pitch dark at night, and you'd be fast asleep, and suddenly you'd feel someone going over you as they were going to go down, to get down onto the ground and go out. And so you'd wake up, and then, of course, once you're awake, you can't get back to sleep again, because believe it or not, 660 people all sleeping is a hell of a noisy place. Yeah, people snoring, tossing, turning, groaning, moaning, sleep talking, and all sorts of things were going on. And you could well imagine it was not easy. And this next slide gives you some idea of the sort of general drabness of what Westerbork really looked like. We had... The food we had there was monotonous, but it was adequate. We didn't starve in this place. We had no schooling at all. We just were kept very much to ourselves. But what I do remember particularly was that you began to learn how to look after yourself. I happened to be, on this particular occasion, completely on my own. My mind was miles away. I was probably thinking about happy days before the war. And I was just wandering along as a little child of 8 would do. And suddenly, I came across the perimeter fence. 6-foot-high perimeter fence. I looked behind me, and I'd wandered over no man's land, this flat piece of land, right up to the perimeter wire. And I looked up, and there was a guard looking down at me with his machine gun and a searchlight. Then I looked along the wire, and about 20 meters away were 2 German guards with an Alsatian dog. I froze. I looked at them, they looked at me, and then they unleashed this dog, and this snarling Alsatian came bounding towards me, and I remember putting my hands up in front of my face like this. I was bitten all over my arms, my chest, my thighs, my legs, and I can still hear these guards, laughing at this bit of Jew baiting, this 8-year-old being mauled by this vicious Alsatian before they called it off. And I ran back to the barracks, bleeding from all these bite marks, but I'd learnt my lesson. After that, if I got to a corner, I would look before I proceeded. If I saw guards, that's Scarpa. Keep well away from guards. They're bad news. And there's no use going to mummy or daddy because they're not there. You have to look after yourself. You have to learn how to look after yourself. As children, we made an alphabet. We called it the Westerbork alphabet, and my mother made me write it down in my best handwriting in 1945 here in England. I've translated it, but I won't go through it all because of time constrictions. But it starts off with A are the potatoes on which the Jews have to live, B are the jobs we all desire to have, and it ends with Z is the sun which will shine once again. Westerbork was a transit camp. Every Tuesday, without fail, a transport would leave. Mainly they were going to a place called Auschwitz. Another favorite destination was Sobibor, all organized by Eichmann. If you were lucky, you went to a place called Belsen-Bergen. And the occasional transport, they went to a place called Theresienstadt, or Terezin, as it was called in the Czech Republic. And you could feel at the weekend the sort of fear building up. On Monday, the list to go up, pandemonium for those who were on it, sigh of relief for those who weren't. So people were desperate to get themselves some sort of job within the camp so that they would not be sent on these transports. If you became an important cog in the wheel that kept this place going. Jews coming in, Jews being selected, Jews being transported, new Jews coming in. They had to be put in various barracks and things like that. Anyway, so people were very, very wary. Let's get ourselves a job. And so here's a couple of examples of this bureaucracy. The type one is of my mother appealing to the clothing department for 2 pairs of children's shoes for my elder brother and myself because the shoes we were wearing couldn't be repaired anymore. What a joke that was. They were worn out. And the lower one is a medical examination of my feces. That's my poo, in case you don't know. I had an infestation of worms. And so although food was going in this way, I was actually being eaten away by these worm infestation because of these unhygienic conditions in which we were living. And when I came to England after the war, it took 18 months of treatment at Great Ormond Street Hospital before they got rid of this worm infestation out of my gut. One of the things I remember most about my time in Westerbork was, it was in May 1944. I had been outside playing, and I'd just come into the barrack when suddenly I heard a howl from the sky, a sort of and then a rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. And I looked up at the pitched roof of our barrack and I saw a hole suddenly appearing in the roof. And I thought, what on earth is going on? And another howl and more rat-tat-tats and panic and pandemonium and people screaming and shouting and running in all sorts of directions. And I was caught up in this panic and I ran through a hail of bullets instinctively to my table. I wasn't even scratched. It was almost as if there was this invisible shield completely around me, protecting me. And when I got to my table, there was this lovely, kind old man that we've come to love. He and his wife, we sort of adopted them as our sort of surrogate grandparents. He was slumped across the table, riddled with holes, blood pouring out of his body over the trestle table and in a stream onto the floor. And that was the first time I came face to face with death. And it was the death of someone we'd come to love. And the greatest tragedy of all was that this man who loved England so much was killed by British bullets fired from British aircraft. Yet another example when the intelligence is completely wrong, they got the wrong target, and our barrack was completely destroyed. So suddenly, as a result of that, those who were still around, we were moved into all sorts of different barracks within the camp organization. So whereas before, as you're like a flock of sheep, you feel sort of mutual protection when you're all together. Now we were wide away. And I found myself in barrack number 71, where I met a man who was growing some tomatoes outside the barrack room window. And I was fascinated by what he was doing. What he'd done was he'd got hold of some rotten tomatoes and he'd opened them up and he'd taken the pips out and he'd managed to germinate them. And he had this whole row and he was cultivating these tomatoes. And I was fascinated by what he was doing as a result of my previous experience in Barneveld. And I became his little helper. I would help him water these tomatoes. And I would help him pick out the side shoots so that the tomatoes would grow up nice and straight. And one day this man said to me, "Stephen, I'm afraid I've been put on a transport to Poland. I won't be able to look after my tomato plants anymore now, but will you look after them for me?" And I said, yes, I'll look after them. I felt so proud he should ask me to look after his tomato plants, which I did until it was my turn to go to. But you know, the strange thing is that today I live in a house not far from here. I've got a large garden. In that garden I've got a greenhouse, and in that greenhouse I grow tomatoes. And every time I'm watering those tomatoes, or I'm picking out the side shoots, I see this man looking on. I'm still watering his tomato plants, 73, 74 years on. I haven't let him down. It's very strange. I can see his face so clearly, but I don't know his name. And then it happened. The list went up, and our names were on it. The Allies were now at Arnhem, the big battle at Arnhem. We were put on a transport to go to a place called Theresienstadt. I remember my mother getting us ready for this. 3 pairs of socks, 3 pairs of pants, 2 pairs of trousers, 3 vests, 2 shirts, 2 pullovers. I was probably just about wearing every bit of clothing that I had, and a little rucksack which we were allowed to take with us as well. And we then proceeded to the ramp, and there I saw this black rectangular hole of a cattle truck, and we were pushed into it. More and more and more until it was absolutely crammed full. And then suddenly I heard a rum bang behind me as they slid the door shut. And people started to shout and scream. And your eye, because it was pitch dark, your eyes didn't get accustomed to the light. And there were actually 4 tiny little slits of windows in our cattle truck. Somebody took control. The rucksacks and things were piled into 2 corners. It allowed some people to sit. And I then embarked upon a journey that I shall never, ever forget. Oh, what's happened here? All right, thank you. What did I do? Press it wrong. We then embarked upon a journey that I shall never, ever forget. 39 hours in a cattle truck. No food, no sleep, no water. And what I remember most about it was the stench that built up in that cattle truck. If you can imagine a mixture of human sweat, of vomit, of poo, of pee, all mixed in. The oxygen levels were depleting, going down and down. We were getting up on the rucksacks and things to get to the little window, to get the air. The adults were pulling us back because it was taking it away from them. And then suddenly this train stopped. It was dark. It was night time. I heard this great big room as the door was slid open. And I remember this great big waft of ice cold air that came into the cattle truck. I could breathe again. You know, for some of you who swim, if you dive into the swimming pool, you get to the bottom, and the last thing you want to do is to stay down there. You push yourself off to get back to the top so you could breathe the air again. It's like that in sort of slow motion. And we'd arrived in Theresienstadt, or Terezin. This is a Dutch transport, not ours, that's arriving in the camp there. Theresienstadt was built in 1780 by Emperor Joseph II of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in memory of his mother, Maria Theresa. It was originally built to house 8,000 soldiers with their families. The Germans crammed 44,000 Jews in the same space, so you could imagine how overcrowded it was. In the foreground is the Hamburger barracks, where we were dumped on the floor. We were on that second, the further quadrangle there, and those sort of black things you can see there are open holes into corridors, open arches into corridors with rooms with windows on the outside. So all those corridors were open there. And we were right in the middle one, right in the corner there, that you can see, sort of in sort of semi-shadow. That's where we were dumped. My mother, now realizing that things were going to get pretty tough in Theresienstadt, volunteered to go and work in the camp hospital laundry. There she had access to hot water, and when nobody was looking, or the authorities weren't looking, she could wash her children's clothes. She could wash adults' clothes and barter that for food, because we starved in this camp. Because the typhus epidemic had started. Don't get typhus muddled up with typhoid. So many people do. Typhus is a louse. It lives on you. It has a particularly vicious bite. And when you're starving, you die. Millions died of typhus. And the only way you could keep it at bay was to try and keep yourself as clean as you possibly could. So she would wash and try and keep her children as clean as she could. Theresienstadt was infamous It wasn't a killing place. It was a holding camp. We were just waiting our turn to be sent off to the extermination camps further east into Poland, etc. So it was just a holding place. It was like being in a waiting room for the doctor, just waiting your turn to be called. So people still wore their own clothes. You still had to wear the star. The cart that you see there, when we got there, was now being used to cart the corpses to the crematorium because people were dying in such great numbers. Those torpedo-shaped things you see in the cart are loaves of black bitter bread, of which we would see 2 slices a day. Whereas in Westerbork, under Adolf Eichmann's direction, transport would leave every Tuesday without fail. In Theresienstadt, it was completely different. There would be a time of inactivity, then a great cluster of lots of transports going. And I can remember on one occasion, on one of these clusters, the guards, they came to our children's home, where we now were. It was a Dutch children's home that we had been sent to. And they came in for a selection. They knew exactly who they were looking for. For example, if you two were sisters, they take you and leave you behind. If you two were brothers, they take you and leave you behind. And if there was a brother and a sister, they take one and leave the other behind. And I witnessed this howling, this screaming that went on. Please, please, let me go with her. Or let me stay with him. To which the guards would respond, Nein, du, raus, schnell. Those going to Auschwitz to their certain deaths. Those remaining behind to a very uncertain future. And the evilness about it all was that the Germans had taken the last bit of the siblings that were left. Their mothers and fathers, gone. Brothers and sisters, disappeared. All these children had left for one another, and the Germans deliberately broke that last link. And that cruelty still riles me deeply inside when I think of how they could do something as evil as that. Attached to the camp, we had the little fortress. This is where people were taken for special treatment. Theresienstadt became infamous because it was visited by the International Red Cross. It was the Danes again who were the ones who were wanting to see what's happening to their Danish people that were there. And it became a sort of, they were allowed to come and they were escorted around the camp by the guards. The Red Cross could never talk to anybody. They weren't allowed to look into the living quarters. As they went through the camp, they could see people in clothing shops pretending to be buying clothes, but they weren't. People in coffee shops pretending to be drinking coffee, but they weren't. The whole place was, as I said, given a lick of paint. The old emaciated people had been sent off to the killing fields of the East, so it looked as if this was a town for the Jews, administered by the Jews. And so the whole thing was, it looked as if this was a town, especially, but it was, as I said, it was nothing like that at all. My mother, because she worked in the camp hospital laundry, was given money with which you couldn't buy anything with. You could only put it into the savings book. And just like this sort of way that the Germans mocked the Jewish faith by writing the word Jew like this on the star, you had a similar thing here, because each note had a picture of Moses on there. And I'm led to believe he's pointing to the one that says, "Thou shalt not kill." You got 1 meal a day. They'd clip off a number like that, and that would be your lot. As the war was coming to end, transports were coming from the east, people barely alive, and we then learnt about the gas chambers. My mother, because she worked in the camp hospital laundry, was given extra rations, which she used to put in this pan, and she would come from time to time to the children's home to give us a bit of food, because she used to take the bread from her extra rations and bread that she bartered for washing adults' clothes, put it in this pan and mix it up with hot water. And she'd come to the children's home with one spoon in this pan when it was about 2/3 full, and each one in turn would be fed. I still have guilty conscience because other children were looking on. Right near the end, my mother, returning from the camp hospital laundry, was approached by some Russian prisoners of war we now had. They knew my mother was a native English speaker, and they pleaded with her to go into their house, which she did. And in the attic of their house, they'd hidden a radio. Would you believe it? A radio. And they knew something was going to be broadcast, but they didn't know what it was. And they gave my mother pencil and paper. And this is what she heard.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m., at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Force.
Now, can someone tell me whose voice that was? Yeah, I hear somebody whispering over here. Winston Churchill, that's right. So my mum was probably the very first person in the camp to know that at midnight that night the war was over. Because this was about 6 o'clock in the evening. What were the Germans going to do? They'd built these new Mark III maximum throughput gas chambers in Theresienstadt. Were they going to use them now, or were they going to shoot us, or a mixture of both? There'd even been a rumor that the whole place had been dynamited. They were just going to blow us all up. So people went to bed fearful, if they went to bed at all. And in the following morning, the Russians entered the camp, and of course amid great joy, and they didn't want to stay there because people were dying like flies from all the diseases, and it was taken over by the Red Cross. I would like to conclude by reading you a poem. This is an eyewitness account of life in Theresienstadt, but written in English. You get very, very little first-hand accounts of life in a concentration camp written in English. It was written by a woman called Connie Rosenheimer. Connie was born in Sydney, Australia, had married a Dutchman, found herself in Holland, and she and my mother became close friends. And she dedicated this poem to her friend Charles, but I never knew who Charles was. When walking sadly through the street, I view the people who I meet. They are so grey, so feeble old, and many trembling from the cold. No happy faces to be seen in Terezin, in Terezin. In the bare park I take a seat and speak to several whom I greet. Sad are the tales of blank despair, for dear ones gone they know not where. No tales of joy, of life serene, in Terezin, in Terezin. And stumbling, halting, there they go, the heroes of the past, so slow. It fills my heart with pain severe, for many blind and maimed are here. There is, alas, no happy scene in Terezin, in Terezin. With beating heart and troubled eye, again I view the passers-by. Through mud and snow, through storm and rain they pass, a melancholy train, with pan in hand, with hunger keen, in Terezin, in Terezin. O God, in mercy grant the peace that this sad life may shortly cease. Grant that we once again return to those for whom we fondly yearn, to our own home, how humble mean, not Terezin, not Terezin. Perchance, when back in London town, a tear will slowly trickle down, and I will ponder with a sigh on the dear friend who said goodbye, who was my friend, had always been, in Terezin, in Terezin. 15,000 children went to Terezin. Out of those 15,000, only 93 of us survived. And I give this talk in the memory of all those children who never came home. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Stephen, for sharing your extraordinary story with us. If you can gather your thoughts, Stephen would love to hear your questions. I know he's had to whiz through that part of his life. There is another chapter to his life. So we always say there's no such thing as a silly question. If somebody be brave enough to put their hand up to get the ball rolling. Be very clear. Somebody over there.
What happened to the Nazis after the war ended? I don't think that microphone's working. Well, they just disappeared. You know, most of them tried to sort of merge themselves into the local populations, or the population they try to get back to their countries of origin, Germany, or it might be Latvia or Ukraine or whatever it is. You know, all these Nazi guards, they tried to just disappear. Several of them, of course, were caught, and the notorious ones were easily recognized, and of course they were duly dealt with. a lot of them just tried to sort of hide and get away. And in fact, a lot of them, some of the leading ones, managed to get to South America. They were, sad to say, they were helped by the Catholic Church. It's a very sad episode in the history of World War II.
What made you feel that you wanted to explain your story to us?
I felt enormously privileged to be one of those who survived. You know, I've over my long life now, I've enjoyed sport, I've enjoyed love, I've enjoyed bringing up a family, seeing the joy of my children growing up, and now the joy of seeing my grandchildren growing up, something that was denied to so many of my peers in the camps. And when I retired, it became obvious that it was time to give something back for the life and the enjoyment of the life that I have had. And so I started giving talks in schools. I've done over 700 of them now, and I shall go on doing it until I drop dead, or until these people here come and cart me out of my house on a stretcher and bring me here to give my talk. But I will go on talking as long as it takes, because I feel this is my destiny, having had the joys of living, and now is the time of giving. Giving back, so that people like you don't make the same mistakes that those people made in the 30s. And my goodness me, it's more important now than it ever has been, by what one hears, what's going around in the world today.
Do you feel like this experience has made you stronger?
Oh gosh, yes. But we're all built, you know, we're all built with a sort of internal strength of one sort or another. And each crisis that you come across, and you know, they're all crises, whatever age you are. You know, you might have just been dumped by your boyfriend, you know, and you feel the world has come to you at the end, you know, and then you think, no, I've got to get over that. We've got to get on with life. And when it happens again, God forbid, but if it did, you're that bit much stronger because you knew how to cope with the last time you did it. And I've had loads and loads of crises in my life, and each time I've overcome them, and because I've got this enormous internal strength that makes me go on and on, you know. Some people give up, but don't ever give up, you know. And when you all leave school, you know, some people say, oh, you can't be a brain surgeon. You're not clever enough to be a brain surgeon. You want to be a brain surgeon? You work for it, and you'll get there. But it's determination for yourself to get where you want to get to. Even the teachers are frightened to ask. Oh dear, oh dear.
How long did it take you to rebuild your life after the war?
That's a very good question, that. You know, I came to England, and the last thing I wanted anybody to know that I was a Jew. You know, that was something you didn't talk about. You didn't talk about the camps. You know, people asked, you know, where were you born? I said, I was born in Amsterdam. I was in Holland in the war, yes. And then we came over here after the war. And that's as far as I would talk about it, you know. And one was desperate to integrate, you know, with the people that we're now with. So I learned English very quickly. And I mean, I remember first of all, of course, when I first came to England, I spoke with a Dutch accent. So in a little primary school I'd started, they used to call me Dutchie. I sort of nickname for being a Dutch boy, I suppose. But very soon I was speaking English probably better than they were. And then the one thing I couldn't hide was my size, because we didn't grow much in the camp. So they used to call me Nipper. It's another bit of a sort of London slang. And then my younger brother joined the school, and he was smaller than me, so I became Big Nipper. He was Little Nipper, you see. So, but very soon, you know, you sort of totally integrate, and you wanted to hide away from all those things that happened before. And it isn't until much, much later in your life, more than 50 years later on, that you begin to talk about the things that have happened. And the reason I talk about it is because, you know, what I see in 2017 is not that different from what was going on in 1930. The way that people are speaking, the way people are behaving is very, very similar, and it's very, very frightening. But hopefully people are much more knowledgeable now than they were then.
Do you ever think something like this could happen again?
Yeah, sadly, what you say there, you're right. I mean, the Holocaust brought about the United Nations and the United Nations Declaration, and since the United Nations has been in existence, we've had genocides in Yugoslavia, as it used to be called, genocides in Darfur, genocides in Rwanda, all over the place. People are being killed, not for what they did, but purely for what they are, what their religion was, and that sort of thing. And yes, and when you see what's happening now, I'm very, very saddened. And I was only thinking about it this morning when, listening on the radio, they talked about the Speaker of the House of Commons said that he didn't want to have Donald Trump coming over to speak to the both houses of Parliament because of what he was, you know, of what his things that he was going to do. And, you know, it took me back to a well-known photograph of when England were playing Germany at Wembley, football, and before the game started, the whole of the England team were there with their hands raised to a Hitler salute. And they did it because, just as what people are saying today, we mustn't offend the Germans. They are good, you know, they're good for business. They're a powerful nation. We do good business with them. We need to be friends with them. And don't worry too much about what this fellow Hitler's doing. And I can see the same thing beginning to happen a bit here now with us and the United States. And you've just got to be very much aware of that and aware of people who, for one reason or another, don't happen to be the same race as you or the same religion as you, but they're just as good as you and have just as much to offer.
Stephen, I think that we've come to the end of that session. Thank you very much for sharing all your experiences with everybody. And I know that lots of questions will be going around in your mind for the rest of the day, if not for weeks and months ahead.
Thank you so much for the present. It's very kind of you. Is that the Royal Masonic School? Are you the Royal Masonic? You are, yes. I know the Royal. My granddaughter went there. Yeah, yeah.
We now come to the part where I spoke of earlier, where we're going to give you a blank postcard. We'd just like you to write a few lines to Stephen, something you've experienced, you've thought about today, and these will be given to him. And at the same time, we're asking the teachers to fill in an evaluation form. We can only give you 5 minutes for this, so please get writing quickly. If the helpers could get round the postcards very quickly. Thank you.